So we all know that science and varying perspectives around COVID have been really kind of pushed aside, especially in the mainstream throughout the course of the pandemic. So much so that a lot of people are completely out of touch with what is actually going on with this pandemic and how different views completely differ. And one of the ways we're going to explore this is by looking at a particular study through which the media completely left out of the entire conversation here in Canada, and you could probably bet in other areas of the world as well. And the study we're going to look at here was done by Douglas W. Allen of Simon Fraser University Economics. He's a professor there. And in this study, it was essentially a meta-analysis of 80 different studies from around the world that looked at how lockdowns affected, the spread of COVID and other collateral damage on top of that. And it was kind of just trying to determine, how effective are these lockdowns and what are the potential issues that occur? And one of the concluding statements of this particular study, which we will link down in the description, is it is possible that lockdown will go down as one of the greatest peacetime policy failures in Canada's history. So to explore this further and to get into the media's role in this entire discussion, we're going to be with Richard Garner here, a host of a Third Way podcast. Welcome, Richard. Let's look at this, because I know we got some really interesting parallels to the book, 1984. So why don't we dive into this?
Well, it's almost not possible to dive into this without a refresher course on the book 1984. Of course, the Georgia Orwell classic, oft cited. I would argue over the years, potentially, not out of context, but sometimes, a bit of a overamplification of a situation. People go right to 1984. Well, if that was true, I would argue that over the last year and a half, the analogy to 1984 is not strong enough, because at least you knew you were reading fiction. To actually be alive during it is traumatizing. I don't think you could say it any other way, because gaslighting is a real thing. There's a psychological effect when you consistently believe that, well, wait a sec, I just saw something that's like 2 + 2 = 4. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You're crazy. Of course, that really, and again, I wouldn't want to underplay how difficult that is for people to deal with, especially with everything else that's been going on. So we hear the term debunking, obviously, and at least I think we're slowly getting to a place where the fact checking and the debunking part of the conversation is getting more and more exposed as a joke, as the people like Snopes and whatever it is, or a couple of people in their basement on the payroll, third party for Facebook, and whoever else out there refuting things with a big red stop sign, and then you actually read it and it's like, well, you didn't refute it at all. You just basically said it's not true. That was already part of it. But what we haven't talked about is, again, the 1984 playbook, and that's the familiar terms like newspeak, that you say one thing that's the contradiction of it. The Ministry of Truth, which again our media has become on behalf of the authority, right? So when people say they're trusting the science, you and I both know what they're saying is, no, I'm trusting the science ... that I saw on CBS News or CTV News or CNN. So, well, what about all the others? Well, there is none. I haven't heard of any. If there's a consensus, it's 100%. Well, obviously, that's insane to even suggest that there would be a 100% consensus, but you'd be forgiven for not knowing just how many people, how many top-level scientists in the world have been out there talking about all things, from whether it be vaccines to lockdowns to mortality rates around coronaviruses, et cetera. And I mean from Ivy League institutions, I mean the top of the top. And I don't mean a couple of people, I mean thousands of scientists around the world. But they've been memory holed. Well, what does memory hole mean, Joe? Again, it's a term from the book 1984. And when you wanted something to disappear, you literally put it down the memory hole. It doesn't exist anymore, Joe. Well, no, I just saw. No, it doesn't. It's gone. Don't know what you're talking about. Even at the beginning, Joe, the Barrington Declaration, okay? which again was essentially memory hold. It was, if it did get mainstream media coverage, it was condemned or ridiculed or dismissed, but it didn't get anywhere near like let's Anderson Cooper and whomever, let's get a panel together to talk about this Barrington Declaration, because we have scientists, top scientists in the world from Oxford, I believe it was Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford. So again, not a couple of jokers, excuse me, from the Barbizon School of Science in a strip mall. These are the top of the top. And they had a whole bunch of different perspectives from the outset, especially around lockdowns, especially around the possible consequences and collateral damage long-term, far outstripping the dangers or the risks of COVID. If you go back and read what a lot of people were saying, well, guess what, Joe? It ultimately came to fruition in a lot of cases. And you go through the numbers on mental health, of course, not shocking, but specifically to kids and what it's done in terms of hospital visits, up 50%, 100% in certain jurisdictions, from people who have been, kids under 18 who've been suicidal, who can't get back to a normal way of life. Obviously, people talked about the difficulty when you made hospital visits almost restricted except in case of dire emergencies. Well, guess what? People talked about, what about cancer screenings? People aren't going to the doctors to get their, well, what do we know about cancer? We know that the early detection of cancer is the number one determinant in prevention of death from cancer. And the strides we've made over the years in that department is massive. Well, guess what? Now we have all the numbers coming out, Joe, that people who weren't getting their cancer screenings, bam, guess what? They've contracted cancer. And guess what? It's far enough along or more advanced at a level where the treatment ability and percentage to be able to treat it has gone down significantly. Heart disease, we could go on and on about all the ramifications. These were things that were being discussed in certain places. The warnings were being sounded, but again and again, they were either being either being censored, people were being deplatformed, these claims were being debunked. We still see mainstream media memory holding significant new data and studies that would allow us to make better decisions going forward, because I guess they just didn't fit the narrative that they had already gone all in on. And now they're not prepared to be able to say anything other than what they'll probably say in 2 or 3 or 5 years when they make a documentary about it. Maybe Joe, you guys will make the documentary. When all of this will become crystal clear, and you'll have people from the top legacy media outlets saying, well, if we knew then what we know now, we might have done things differently. Like, hold on for a second, because not only did you know then what you know now, you chose to not just ignore it, you chose to bury it and hide it. And that's actually, I believe, more dangerous and impactful than just simply debunking something.
Yeah. And it's fascinating when it comes to what you mentioned there about various things with having a socioeconomic statuses. What's going on with the collateral damage of a lot of the measures, the shutting down the economies, all that sort of stuff. What's going on with that, and did the government consider what the full damage would be? And one of the things that he notes, Alan, in the study, is he says, over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been no public evidence that either the federal or provincial governments of Canada have considered both the benefit and cost sides of the policy decisions. So here they are making decisions about what they're going to do with absolutely no idea of what the costs are. To which his study concludes, and this is again a meta-analysis of 80 different studies, he says the benefit of lockdowns, therefore, was the avoidance of around 22,333 years of lost life. However, the cost of lockdown was 6,300,000 years of lost life. So this is not even remotely close to a comparison, and it's really showing what it is that you're talking about. And the fact that we were gaslit as journalists, as people, and saying, hold on a second, there's real concern here. You know, again, what is the media's role in this when they see a study like this and they just decide to avoid it?
Well, you know, we've talked about mass psychosis before on Pulse, right? So that is, at the end of the day, the Pulse, really.
Yeah.
That has been the emotional thread that's led to, you know, a series of unprecedented-ish decisions in institutions, whether they be government, whether they be media, that certainly clouded at least your most reasonable. I mean, people aren't objective on the best of days. They have agendas. But in this particular case, and we've heard this you know, phrase before, once you become a hammer, everything else is a nail. Mm-hmm. So the only lens that this, because of the fear, because of the mass psychosis and the speed of the fear spreading, there was no ability. I mean, people panicked. Let's just call it for what it is. Again, I know neither of us are saying that there wasn't something to be concerned about, to be on top of. There was a lot of unknowns. So that makes it even more understandable, not justifiable, but understandable that there was some panic early on. So at some point, though, the media, and I don't want to speak in that general, the media, each institution will take their cues in a crisis situation from the government. We've seen that in wartime. All of a sudden, everything changes once there's, you know, missiles in the air, that nobody's going to come out and really question the government because the temperature has risen, and, you know, you default to, we have to be in lockstep, no pun intended, with the government in order to be able to do our duty as part of society to help alleviate this crisis that's at hand. So they quickly bought into, they're going to take their cues and their agenda directly from the government, from the anointed health experts, whether that be in Canada here with Tam, or Tony Fauci in the UK, or wherever else. And of course, you assign quite immediately, not because you're thinking rationally, but because you're afraid that, well, this is the expert. They're a god. They're all knowing. They're omniscient. They can't make a mistake. No, you just really want to be told at this point, tell me where to go, tell me what to do, and tell me it's going to be okay, and I'll do it. So once they put a flag in the ground on a certain position, regardless of crisis times or not, we know, like, for instance, when a media institution makes a mistake, their retraction, as the joke goes, is always page 6 in the bottom corner. Meanwhile, the mistake was a headline, right? So they're not proportionate because they don't want to, admit that their reputation should take a hit here. So in this particular case, multiply that by 1,000, by 1,000,000. And then layer onto it that in every boardroom meeting, Joe, think about this, every story meeting day to day in the editorial department, every executive meeting at the highest level, somebody can always say within that meeting, well, people, we have a responsibility here. Lives are at stake. Who's going to push back there, Joe? Who's going to push back when somebody says, okay, the time for healthy debate and discussion? No. There was no point early on where leaders at the national level or the municipal level couldn't say, okay, here's the situation. We're not idiots. We know if we pull on this lever too much, there's going to be collateral damage over here. Let's get a mental health person in here. Let's get a person around the economy, poverty. Let's get a couple of heart people, some cancer people. Let's get the COVID expert in here as well. Let's get all the data on the table. And let's get some Poindexters, as they used to say, into the corner with their analytics machines and spit out some algorithms that deal with the multiple stakeholder risks that we're dealing with. So now we can have a more balanced approach to say, okay, we'll do this, but if we do this too much, we're risking lives over here. In this particular period, lives that did not have to do with case numbers from COVID and the potential risk of dying from COVID all of a sudden, unbelievably, disappeared.
I mean, at the beginning, just to address one of the comebacks I've heard many times is that, the government was operating in a way where they were doing what they thought was best in a crisis situation. And, I think what's fascinating about that is like, yeah, but the information came back really fast. Like you could have locked down for 30 days and then you could have found out, brought in all those people you suggested on that panel and figure out, hey, what damages are these lockdowns going to cause? And then you realize after 30 days, you know what, the damage is too great. We got to stop all the lockdowns and let's move on with life. But no, they didn't do that, right? And as all the studies came out, as we talked about, certain media organizations kept ignoring it. Now, my question here is, and I have a saying oftentimes that says, if you're listening to some sort of politically driven news channel, it's most likely you're not going to get a very clear idea of what's going on in the world because there's a massive bias there. But what is it that stops media from actually being balanced from your perspective? Why can't that work for their business model?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it's a human problem. It's manifested in media that generally as the amount of people, if you can find 5 truly objective people in your life, Joe, buy a lottery ticket. And that's not to say you and I are AI and fully objective. Of course we're not. Yeah. But the prioritization of being objective, I remember specifically, I was working on a show in 2003. And we were talking about an issue. I was the senior producer. The executive producer said, well, do you think we should have that in there? And I said, well, yeah, I don't necessarily agree with this particular group, but it was a show about different religious groups. It was a current affairs show. I was like, well, we got to try to, be objective. And she says to me, she goes, no, actually, that's not true anymore. Breaking news. I did not know. Well, please enlighten. She goes, and again, to me, this is always a bit of a red flag when somebody uses the term at J school. I'm like, hey, here we go, J school. So of course, for the uninitiated, that is journalism school. She says, well, at J school, they've actually abandoned the idea of being objective. In fact, that they believe it to be more disingenuous to be objective because everybody has their biases. So it's actually more, it's more transparent for the reader or the viewer or the audience to know what they are and, for you not to be. I said, okay, I understand that we all have biases, but are we not still striving to be balanced and whatever? And she was like, well, no, those days, whatever. So obviously we live in this period of editorializing and that we should be, it's actually more honest to not be, to put our biases out there and advocate for whatever we believe is right. In this particular case, in most individuals, I would imagine, Joe, they believe that they're doing what was in the interest of the greater good, 100%. Well, what happens when you start to talk about greater good in media or anywhere? Well, you move on to the next ugly cousins of the greater good. The 2 ugly cousins of the greater good that have historically led to mass slaughter, devastation, and pretty much every pockmark on the fabric of the history of humanity is, of course, the end justifies the means, and the pros outweigh the cons. Once you've entered into this territory as a media organization, Joe, everything's on the table. So if you have as your stated or otherwise agenda, let's say, the end is that the Republicans or Trump or whatever never getting elected because they're terrible, misogynistic, racist, whatever. Again, you could argue in certain people's, that's the case. In many people, that's not the case. But if you've made this decision at some point, individually and then organizationally, well, then everything that potentially contributes to that possibility is out. Doesn't matter if it's true. Doesn't matter if it's well-intended. Doesn't matter if it's important health information. If it's going to help in that whatever make them look right or credible, can't do it. And conversely, anything that's going to be able to, potentially hurt our side, because that's how you view the world through that lens, then that's out. Well, what are you left with? You're left with the same narrative and agenda in this particular case that is coming from the government. Well, that's nothing more than you become a mouthpiece. That's authoritarianism.
Yeah.
That is literally the definition of tyranny and authoritarianism. Once you've arrived there, it's very difficult to go back.
Yeah, and that's well said. And, I think this is why we say all the time, sense making and our ability to make good, meaningful decisions and solve problems is just so broken because we're stuck so badly in these biases and inability to navigate the information landscape effectively. But, thanks so much for your insight on this particular topic. As always, Richard, always love picking apart media. It's a fun thing to do. And I think it helps to build media literacy as well amongst people, which is a very important part of navigating this information. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you next time.
Great stuff, Joe. Thanks, man.